This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. Today I am rolling solo once again to talk about deflation and the implications for investment. But before we jump into that scintillating topic, let me give you the following announcement. The Mises Institute would like you to join them on May 15th through 17th at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama for their Revisionist History of War Conference. We will host an exciting lineup of Misesian and Rothbardian speakers, including the great Colonel Douglas MacGregor, USS Liberty survivor Phil Turney, and more. For the ruling classes, war is an opportunity. For the citizens, war means death or crippling injury, taxes, debt, sacrifice, and loss of freedoms. Never is the state's bamboozling and lying more extreme than when the subject is war, for war is the very health of the state. But it's not true that the victors always write history. We can write the history of war too, and that's exactly what we're going to do with our first history conference in almost 30 years. Member registration is $300 and non-member registration is $325. For more details and to register, go to mises.org/RHW. Again, that's mises.org/RHW for Revisionist History of War. Hope you can make it. Okay, so for today's episode, I was emailed by someone who was asking me about deflation, and I said, you know what, this is really a good exercise, a good thing to think through, and so I decided I'll go ahead and talk about this on the next Human Action Podcast episode. So that's what we're doing today. And let me mention, it's not essential, but if you're at your computer, you probably want to be watching the video version of this, at least to have it going, because in a few places I'm going to be flashing tables up on the screen and having numbers to help you visualize what I'm saying. So you'll want to switch over if you're able to. If you're in the car, don't do that. We don't want any accidents. Okay, so the question is that it was posed to me over email, and I realized that, this is a very interesting topic, and you see this a lot. The concern is, hey, if price deflation is too high, doesn't that have some implications for the feasibility of investment? And this often comes up in the context of Bitcoin, but it also would be true just, the concern is there even for any kind of hard money. Like if everybody just started using actual gold coins that, where private mints would stamp and so forth, and that was the actual money of planet Earth, then some people worry about the kind of thing we're going to talk about in this episode as well. But it certainly is also relevant with Bitcoin, because there, in case you don't know, the way Bitcoin works is the most that there will ever be mined, is the term they use, is 21 million. And in fact, even when it gets to that point where 21 million Bitcoins have been entered into the public ledger, there won't actually be 21 million Bitcoins, quote, in circulation being held by people, because some of them along the way will have been lost, right? That people will lose their private keys, and in a sense. So like for an analogy to gold, that would be like, oh yeah, a ship sank and there's a bunch of gold coins at the bottom of the ocean. And so when you just, calculate how much gold has been mined during human history to this point, that's actually not all available to be held as money, even putting aside the stuff that's been used for industrial purposes, because some of the gold has been lost through accident and so forth, right? So there's that element as well with Bitcoin, but no matter what, the hard cap is 21 million. And so one of the objections to using Bitcoin as money is to say, wouldn't that pose a problem that, that would just cause prices quoted in Bitcoins would have to keep falling eventually. So wouldn't that be an issue? And so the sort of naive objection, people will say things like, oh, well, if I'm going to buy something like a refrigerator or a car, but I know that its price will be lower a year from now, then I would just wait for the price to come down and, to get a bargain. And so people would just stop spending money on things. So if it's couched like that, I think the objection is pretty easy to handle. You could say, well, right now that's what happens with computers, even with our inflationary money, right? Computers prices quoted in dollars, and especially if you express it not just in terms of the actual machine, but in terms of its performance. And you say, like, how much am I paying per gigabyte of hard drive space, or, other types of objective metrics like that, then the price of computing is dropping rapidly. Historically has fallen quite dramatically year after year. And yet you wouldn't say, oh, and so that's why nobody ever buys a new computer, right? Because they just realize that at any moment you're tempted to go buy the computer, you realize, if I just wait 6 months, I'll be able to get more computing power for my money. And so I'll just wait. And so that's why no one ever buys a computer, right? Because that's always true. And that's obviously not correct, right? People do bite the bullet and buy computers. And same thing with cars. Even if it were the case that if you just delayed your purchase 6 months, you could get more automobile services for your money, that doesn't prove therefore nobody would ever buy a new car, obviously, right? So that's the way, I just quickly handle that type of sort of like naive objection that says, oh, you got to have a currency that at least gradually loses value over time. Otherwise, nobody would ever spend. Okay. But there's a more sophisticated version of it. And so I think, just to jump right in and to get to the heart of the controversy, let's work through a specific numerical example. All right. So here, if you're looking at this table, what I'm showing is, on the left side, hypothetical rates of CPI inflation. And by the way, just as a standard disclaimer here, in the Austrian tradition, this is something Ludwig von Mises emphasized, the word inflation historically referred to an expansion in the stock of money and possibly bank credit, if depending on how you define it. And then rising prices were the symptom of inflation, right? So monetary inflation, other things equal, caused price inflation. Whereas nowadays, most people, when they use the word inflation, what they mean by that is, oh yeah, when I went to the grocery store, stuff is more expensive than it used to be. Okay, so in this episode, I'm just going to keep saying CPI inflation to mean consumer price inflation, rising consumer prices. Okay. So anyway, back to the narrative here. In this table, I'm showing in that first column a hypothetical rate of CPI inflation. The next column is the nominal interest rate on like a standard loan. And then the next column is showing what the implied real rate of interest is, taking into account the fact that prices are changing. And then finally, I'm going to show the implied cash flows. Okay, so the baseline case, let's just assume for the moment that consumer prices are stable over time, right? So money retains its purchasing power, at least vis-a-vis a basket of consumer goods that the average household wants to buy. And suppose in that framework that the nominal interest rate, so nominal meaning like what the actual money contractual terms are, is 2%. And then in that case, that means the real rate is also 2%, right? So for the implied cash flow, that means a borrower borrows $100 today, and then a year later pays back $102. Okay, so the nominal rate is clearly 2%, right? For you give up $100, you get $102 a year later. So you're earning a nominal, market money rate of interest of 2%. But then also, because those dollars have the same purchasing power when you first lend it and when you get paid back, that means the underlying, quote, real or inflation adjusted is another term you could use besides real, rate of return on that loan is also 2%. Okay? Now let's consider a different scenario, one that's closer to our reality. Suppose in general, consumer prices rise by 3% year after year after year. And that's just the normal state of affairs. So now in that world, if you wanted to maintain a roughly 2% real rate of interest, right? So that a lender, by giving up potential consumption today, is able to get 2% more consumption a year from now, right? So that's sort of like the incentive to save, if you want to think of it like that they're deferring consumption today. So why would they do that? Because, in general, people want to consume sooner rather than later. Oh, well, because you're able to consume more actual stuff a year from now if you're willing to defer. All right. So because prices are rising 3% a year in this scenario, this hypothetical, that means, of course, the nominal rate of interest has to be higher than 2%. And so it'd be roughly 5%. Okay. Incidentally, as a note for mathematical purists here, I'm rounding with the arithmetic, right? Strictly speaking, when you realize how you work with percentages and stuff, it's not just naively adding the percentage points together the way I'm doing here, but it's going to get too complicated. I just want to, nail down the concepts here in terms of economics. We're not going to get too hung up on the precise calculations, but I am just acknowledging that in case there are some purists out there that are like, well, wait a minute, actually, wouldn't there be a decimal point? And yes, there would be, but this is the way to do it, just to get the point across. Okay, and this goes back, it was called the Fisher relation after Irving Fisher, right? So he was one of the first economists to really think a lot about both the theory and the practicalities of interest rates, writing in the early 1900s. And so this idea of, for a given real rate of interest, you add the consumer price inflation rate to it, then that gives you the implied nominal rate. Okay. And so here, the way the loan would actually look in practice is somebody borrows $100 today and then pays back $105 12 months from now. And the idea is the nominal rate of return is 5%, but because prices in general have risen 3%, the lender is really only getting a 2% real return. He's only able to consume 2% more of stuff in a year's time, because even though he got 5% of his, of an increase of premium on his dollars, the dollars don't go as far as the grocery store. He's getting paid back in weaker dollars, put it that way. And so to compensate for that, the nominal rate now has to be 5% to maintain that assumed required real rate of 2%. Okay? Easy enough. But now once you have that idea under your belt, we can say, well, what would happen if instead of consumer prices rising, what if they were gently falling over time, right? So this next example, what if consumer prices gently fall 1% per year? Then what would happen? And so here, it's just the reverse. The Fisher relation still holds up, but now you got to throw in a negative sign. And so here, the nominal rate would be 1% if we want to maintain that assumed real rate of 2% on the loan. And so as far as the cash flows, the monetary loan contract would be, yep, I will borrow $100 from you today, and in 12 months' time, I will pay you back $101. So the nominal rate is just 1%, or the money rate of interest is 1%. But again, because you're getting paid back in stronger dollars, right? Because prices in general, we've assumed, have fallen 1% over the course of the year, the real return on that loan to the lender is actually 2%. Because he's getting paid back, he has more dollars and those dollars go farther. Okay, so that's kind of like the reward, if you will, to his saving, is that now he's got 2% more purchasing power with that original bundle of cash that he lent out rather than just spending at the grocery store, at time zero. Okay, so far so good. But now we finally, that I had that warm up and I make sure you understand the concepts involved. Now we get to the issue, and this is what the person who emailed me was concerned about. That what happens if the CPI inflation rate, deflation rate, right, the falling consumer prices is so high that it would require a negative nominal rate. All right, so for example, suppose prices in general are falling 5% per year, measured in the money that the community uses. And so if you wanted to maintain that 2% real rate of interest, then that means the nominal rate would have to be negative 3%, right? And you say, oh, yeah, what's the problem, Bob? That's, and that means that someone today who's lending out $100, the borrower would say, I'll give you $97 a year from now. And you say, oh, you're losing $3. The nominal interest rate is negative 3%, but those dollars are a lot stronger that you're getting paid back with. And so actually the implied real rate is still 2%, right? Again, rounding with the arithmetic, that you gave up $100 today, and then next year you're getting paid back $97, but because prices have fallen 5% in the interim, that $97 a year from now can buy 2% more stuff than your $100 today could. And so that's the sense in which by you abstaining from consumption today, you're able to carry forward and then get 2% more real consumption a year from now, just like in the other examples. So that's how we solve it, right? But here's the problem. Why would somebody lend $100 today just to get paid $97 a year from now when they could just hold the cash, right? So the idea is that the problem, or the apparent problem, when you have relatively large price deflation, is that there's a floor on nominal interest rates, that so long as people have the escape hatch and they can just hold cash, then it seems like the nominal interest rate, the lowest it could possibly be, is 0%, because people can, quote, earn a 0% return just holding their cash. So why would anybody lend or invest in a project that was going to have a negative nominal rate of return when they could just have the alternative of holding cash? Okay, so that's the issue. And so then the concern is, if we did have a hard money, like everybody starts using gold coins again, or people embrace Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency that, has an inbuilt limit on how fast the money stock expands, such that we think in equilibrium, the quantity of goods produced is going to rise faster than the money stock. And so that's going to imply, falling unit prices of the various goods and services. Well, if that's too aggressive, then, couldn't you get into a situation there where you couldn't have the real rate being sufficient to get anybody to be willing to actually invest, and when everyone just want to switch and hold cash? And so then, if investment becomes impossible and nobody wants to lend or invest, doesn't that pose a problem for the economy? And so doesn't that mean any good monetary system has to, at least in general, foster the outcome that consumer prices are gently rising over time, at the very least? And that's, by the way, what a lot of mainstream economists think. They have other things going on in their modeling in terms of, what the central bank's job is and how to help when there's, business cycle fluctuations. But generally, that's why they would say, we think the Fed should target a 2% CPI rate as opposed to 0, right? You may have wondered that. Like, why is it that they want to build in, by design, the fact that the money loses 2% purchasing power year after year? That's the Fed's target. Like if consumer prices only rose 1%, the Fed would say, oh man, we're not diluting the value of the dollar enough. We did a bad job this year. The dollar only lost 1% of its value, right? So in case you're why do they think that? This is one of the reasons, right? Again, there's other stuff that we won't get into in this episode as to why mainstream economists think that, but I'm saying this is one of the reasons. Okay. So in response to that, let me make a few points. So the first thing I want to show is that demonstration that I just walked through does not imply that in such a world, nobody would be willing to invest in actual production processes. Okay, even though it seems like I just proved that, that's not the case. And specifically, the reason is that when you invest in a production process, you are spending the money today on the factors of production, the things that are going to go into making whatever the final good or service is, for your customer. And those are different things. And so you can have, a sort of repeating equilibrium where in general, the price of every type of good and service falls a certain amount year after year. And yet that still allows for the possibility that people can earn a positive nominal rate of return through investing in real processes. Okay, so let me just give you a simple example. That'll be easier than me just continually saying it in words. Let me just show you an example, and it'll be obvious what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's imagine the production process we have in mind is producing a bottle of wine that's aged 1 year. And that's what we're going to go, sell to the consumer in the liquor stores. That a bottle of wine that's 1 year old as of the time of purchase. Okay. And so how do you make such a bottle of wine? Well, there's various inputs. You got to get the glass, you got to get some, worker hours, you got to take some grapes and crush them and so forth. All right. You got to get the material to make the cork, get the label, all that stuff. The glue to put the label on the bottle. Okay. All those things have to go into it. And so my modest point here is that all of those things, the labor, the glass, the grapes, the label, the glue, and so forth, the cork, all those things are different from a bottle of wine that is 1 year old, right? And so you can have the prices of all those different things falling by, let's say, 5% a year, and that still leaves open the possibility that an investor could make a positive money rate of return by paying money for the materials, hiring the worker and buying the glass and the cork and whatever in order to make a bottle of wine and then sell it a year later. Okay. So here's a simple example. If you now look at this table that I've got up there, so you can see the two types of things we're looking at are a 1 year bottle of wine and then all of the inputs necessary to make that bottle. Those are the two types of things whose prices we're looking at. So today, let's assume that 1 year bottle of wine sells for $100. Okay, obviously that's a big number. I just picked that to make the math simple, right? And now we're just going to look across that top row at first, all right? And so that means in 12 months, if we're assuming prices are falling in general 5% a year, that means that bottle, so in 12 months' time, a 1 year old bottle of wine sells for $95. Let me just avoid confusion. Here, I'm not talking about the same physical bottle, right? Because if today you're saying a 1 year old bottle of wine sells for $100, and then a year from now, I'm talking about a different bottle of wine that at that point is 1 year old. If we were talking about the same physical bottle, at that point, it would be a 2 year old bottle of wine, right? So I just want to be clear. Don't get confused. I'm talking about a fresh, a different bottle of wine that a year from now, at that point, is, in fact, a 1 year old bottle of wine, right? So we're doing apples to apples because, the older wine gets, generally speaking, the better it gets, the higher price you could get for it. Okay? Just like if you said, what's the price of a Big Mac today, and then you said a year from now, what's the price of a Big Mac? You obviously aren't talking about the same burger. No, it'd be disgusting a year from now, right? You're talking about a freshly made Big Mac today is how much. A year from now, how much at that point would a freshly made Big Mac be? That's what you mean. So likewise here, we're saying today, a bottle of wine that right at this moment is 1 year old, how much is it? It's $100. And then you say a year from now, at that point, a bottle of wine that at that moment is itself 1 year old, how much would it sell for? And we're saying $95. Okay, and then you do the same process 2 years from now. At that moment in time, a bottle of wine that is 1 year old, how much would it sell for? $90.25. Because again, the 95 then, falls 5% to the new spot price of $90.25. Okay, so that's the way things work in this economy. When you fix a particular good or service, we assume every year that thing measured in dollars becomes 5% cheaper. Okay, and so now the question is, how could we get investors to invest in this, right? Like, why would somebody spend $100 today to buy an inventory of bottles of wine and then carry them for a year and then sell them for $95? They could just hold their cash. And the answer is because the way you obtain 1 year from now a bottle of wine to sell to people that's 1 year old is not by buying a bottle of wine today. That's not the production process. No, today, what you have to spend your money on as an investor in order 1 year from now to be in a position to sell a 1 year bottle of wine, today you're buying grapes and labor and glass and corks and labels and glue. That's what you're buying today to make something that 1 year from now you can sell as a 1 year old bottle of wine. And so there's nothing in what I've said so far, and the fact that prices, we assume, all fall by 5% per year, there's nothing I've said that rules out the possibility that you could still make money doing that. So in particular, suppose today, when you add up all the different costs of paying the workers to, crush the grapes and whatever, and getting the glass that you need and the cork and the label and the glue, you add all that up together and it costs you $94 today to get all that stuff to make the bottle of wine that's, brand new, and then you're just going to hold it for a year. And I'm not worried about storage costs, just to keep things simple here. Okay, so if that were the case, then what do we see? That, by spending $94 today as an investor, in 1 year time, you expect to be able to sell that 1-year-old bottle of wine for $95. And so you earned a slightly positive nominal rate of return on your investment, right? And so that's better than if you just sat on your cash, right? If you had your $94 that you were thinking about investing in the wine production process, and you just instead decided, no, I'm just going to sit on the cash, what would you have in 12 months' time? You would have $94, right? You had your 94 in the beginning, and you would just hold it a year, and you'd still have 94 after the year was up. But instead, by investing in the wine production process, you've turned your $94 into $95. So you earned more than just that slight return, right? In real terms, because now prices in general are 5% lower. But the point is, it's better to have $95 of stronger money than to only have $94 of stronger money, right? So I'm just showing with this simple example how it is that even in an environment where every price falls, let's say 5% per year, you can still have an incentive for investors to invest in real physical production processes, right? And then again, just to looking at this table, likewise, a year from now, people would still be willing to invest in wine production because at that point, they would only have to spend $89.30, right? Because that's $94 falling 5% to get all the factors, the inputs that you need to make a new bottle of wine at that point, which then they expect to be able to sell a year later for $90.25 at that point. So they're still earning a slightly positive nominal rate of return. Okay, so that's the way this works. Okay, and so I'm just showing that whatever it is you might be worried about in terms of, if the money is too hard, doesn't that mean if regular prices in general are falling at too steep of a rate over time, that then investors would have no incentive to actually continue producing things? And I'm just showing that, no, that doesn't follow at all. At best, all you're showing is it might put a wrinkle on people just lending out cash, to then get cash paid in return. That at most, that's all it's doing, but it's certainly not showing that this is somehow going to arrest the investment in physical production processes. Okay, let me dwell on that for a moment, that in general, a lot of the people who bring up these concerns, I'm not saying the person who emailed me about this, but in general, a lot of the more mainstream oriented people, and you see this a lot, like in response to a Ron Paul quote or something on social media, right? Like somebody will show a graph of the purchasing power of the dollar falling over time since the creation of the Fed. And Ron Paul's take is, look at how much they've destroyed the value of the dollar. And I've often seen more mainstream economist types or like policy wonk types say things like, yeah, that's a good thing, right? If the dollar strengthened over time or even retained its value, then you just have people hoarding cash instead of investing. And we don't want that. It should be the case that hot dogs become more expensive over time. That's what gets people to do things besides hoarding hot dogs and stuff, right? I'm not putting words in their mouth. Like that's actually what I've seen people say, arguments along those lines, that they want there to be a penalty on holding cash because otherwise households would just hoard it. And that is wrong, right? That what I mean is it's wrong to think it would be bad for the economy if households, quote, hoarded cash. Okay. And so the basic point here is, in general, when a household saves, what does that mean? They have a certain income, and then instead of spending it all on consumption, they live below their means. And then once you do that, right, that you don't just go and spend your entire income on consumption, goods that give you services for your direct enjoyment that period. Instead, you're directing some of that income to things that will give you enjoyment down the road. So one avenue is you could just go and buy bonds and corporate stock and real estate and stuff like that, and everybody's okay with that. But another possibility is you could just use it to add to your cash balances, right? And I want to say economically, there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I would argue one of the problems, one of the perverse outcomes of the inflationary environment that was unleashed when Nixon finally put the last nail in the coffin of the gold standard in 1971 is that households now had to go and invest in riskier things than they typically did, right? That it wasn't just, oh yeah, you can invest in, whole life insurance and bonds issued by the railroads or something, real safe, conservative things, that you had to go and get into the stock market, for example. And then that's partly why closing the gold window, unleashing, unprecedented consumer price inflation rates for peacetime in U.S. history, why that wasn't perfectly lined up, but that went hand in hand with the rise of mutual funds, and then the average American then having their, quote, retirement tied up in the stock market. And we sort of take that for granted now, but it doesn't need to be like that, right? That it's actually kind of perverse that, like, when 2008 happened and the stock market dropped 40% in a short period of time, like, I actually know people that they had to postpone their retirement because, they had all their 401k and this and that, and they met with their financial planner periodically. And yep, you got this much saved and you're going to draw it down. We're going to flip over and buy some annuities once this hit. And then boom, the stock market drops and they realize I have to keep working because now my plan doesn't work, right? So I'm saying that is not just, hey, that's how the world works. That's how the world works when the government is in control of the currency and debases it. And people realize that, oh yeah, you can't just hold cash or even low nominal interest paying fixed income assets that are very safe and conservative because you'll get killed by inflation. You got to go, you got to go out on the yield curve, on the risk curve. You got to have a higher risk appetite, right? So I'm just saying that that's not normal. That's not a good thing. Economics doesn't teach that, or sound economics doesn't teach that. Okay, so if you're a household and your point is not to invest in particular lines because you think that, yes, that I really like what that company's doing, and I think they're going to outperform, and so yeah, I want to acquire some shares of stock in that company because I want to get access to that flow of dividends. And that, no, if it's not that you have some particular insight into what type of company you think is well managed and is in a lucrative market and so forth, or it's not that, oh yeah, that real estate over there, I think that's a good location. And I think actually the market has undervalued that particular plot of land. So I'd like to buy that because that's not, it's just more, I want to defer consumption now because I want to be able to consume more down the road, like when my kid's going to college or to pay for my daughter's wedding, or when I retire and I'm not earning an income from an employer, I want to have a stockpile of wealth that I can start drawing down at that point. I'm saying if that's what the household's trying to do, then it's perverse that our current system forces them to invest in specific things where they have no expertise. And that actually what would make more economic sense is if there were a vehicle by which the households could generically defer consumption without getting very particular about the particular investment lines that their abstention from consumption made possible. And so in a world where the money itself earns 3% per year, in the sense that in general prices are falling 3% a year, and so that a household that just wants to have a very modest rate of real return on its savings, and it's, not looking to make particular investments, it's just saying, no, I just want to defer consumption to be able to, push it forward in time, or push it backward in time, I guess, instead of pulling it forward, to defer it. And then, it'd be nice to earn a little bit of a premium. That makes sense. Okay. And again, as that silly wine example shows, in general, if a bunch of households are abstaining from consumption and are just, quote, hoarding cash, that's fine, right? It's not that forevermore, oh, geez, all the factories are going to be running at 20% capacity and there's all these coal mines and natural gas deposits and whatnot that now won't be exploited. And there's all these workers now who'll just sit at home watching reruns because, nobody's going to hire me. No, the prices of all those, quote, idle resources would just fall to be consistent with the new equilibrium, and then they would get hired again. Okay, so that's the point I'm trying to make here. And that actually it's not just that it wouldn't be a catastrophe, it's arguably better that what would happen in that kind of a framework is the households who really don't have a particular intuition or judgment about how specifically society's real resources ought to be deployed. And they're just kind of saying, no, I don't need to dip into that right now. I don't need to buy a new TV. I don't need to go out to eat so much. I'd like to live below my means to just have my options open 20 years from now, that they can hold cash, right? And that frees up the real resources. The prices of those things fall, and so that's how it can be coordinated. It doesn't have to be the way we often think about it is, when the household saves, then it has extra money, and then it lends that to a bank, by buying a CD or putting it into a savings account, and then the bank goes and lends it out to businesses, and that's how it can work that way, but I'm saying it doesn't need to. It can also work if the households literally just add cash to their cash balances and don't spend it, then that necessarily means the prices of the consumption goods they might have otherwise bought are going to fall because now the household spending on them has fallen. And then that lowers prices throughout the chain and allows businesses to bid away those factors to go make other things, right? So in any event, that's the main economic point I'd like to make. And then finally, let me just address one loose end here. With all this stuff, I think it's worth thinking through, why are we having this stipulated price deflation in the first place? Because that helps shed light on whether you think this is going to be a problem. All right. So in the case of, let's say it's Bitcoin or gold coins, for example, that, the Bitcoin eventually is going to cap out at 21 million. And so at that point, the reason you would think prices are going to keep falling year after year measured in Bitcoins or Satoshis is if you think that real GDP is still going to be positive, that every year more goods and services are being produced than the prior year. And so if there's a fixed number of Bitcoins, that implies, it's not mechanical, but other things equal, that implies that the price of a haircut and of a new car and of a house and 12 eggs and so forth, measured in Bitcoins or Satoshis, is going to have to fall over time, right? And so I'm saying it's weird to say, oh no, in that kind of a framework, how could we have real economic growth, right? Like the thing you're worried about is consistent with there being real economic growth. That's partly what my point is, okay? So it would be weird to say that, oh no, with a fixed stock of money or a slowly growing stock, like if it's gold coins or something, that if there's, let's say AI produces rapid technological innovation in certain sectors and, the AI figures out how to make robots that can go and, use fertilizer and different irrigation techniques and whatnot, and then harvesting methods that we can quadruple agricultural output. Okay, and that you don't need to be worried, right? So the reason prices are falling so much, and then that seems to be posing a problem, is because real output is exploding so much, right? So the very scenario in which you could be really worried about, oh no, look at the implications of a fixed money stock or a gently rising money stock, is you're saying if real output is growing too aggressively, then won't that mean real output can't grow? And no. The thing causing the ostensible problem is an expansion of real output, right? So there's that element. And then let's consider the other possibility. Suppose for whatever reason that, like let's say you're using gold, right? That the world is using gold coins as money, and eventually all the mines, we get all the stuff that's easily accessible. And yeah, there's technically some more gold that's physically located deeper in the Earth's crust, but it's just not economical to dig it up. And then, suppose there's some kind of weird thing, who knows what, some weird chemical reaction or whatever that actually makes 2% of the gold physically deteriorate year after year. Some weird thing, I don't need to explain what it is. Let's just make it up. There's some Wuhan lab experiment gone wrong, and something comes out, and it's like there's these microbes or whatever that just actually eat gold and, decompose it into baser metals or something. Okay? And just the way things work in general, the stock of gold coins and bars that's held on planet Earth shrinks 2% a year. So it's not just that, the stock of money isn't growing rapidly, it's actually shrinking, right? And so then the issue would be, does that mean humanity at that point would necessarily have to switch away from the gold and into something else? Would that make economic, pricing and so forth impossible? And I was saying no, because in general, we now move away from the issue of people could always just hold their cash and earn a 0% rate of return, right? That was the stumbling block, remember, right? So in general, without that consideration, using the Fisher relation, you could have a stipulated fall in consumer prices, and then you could get whatever rate of real interest that you wanted by just making the nominal interest rate, accordingly, but it might be negative. And then we were saying, oh no, that won't work in practice because people can always just hold their $100 bill for a year. But I'm saying if the money, stock itself is shrinking, well then no, you can't. Right? That if somebody has 100 gold coins and we're saying if he just sits on them, the microbes are going to eat away some of them, and that's going to shrink to, I forget what I said, 97 gold coins a year from now. Well, then if he invests it in a process, or he lends it out to somebody and they're going to pay him 98 gold coins a year from now, he's still better off than by sitting on it, right? Even though there's a negative 2% nominal rate of interest in that loan. But he lends out 100 gold coins today and gets 98 next year. Okay, if that's too fanciful, you can imagine, a cryptocurrency. Let's say there's some new cryptocurrency that sweeps the world, that for whatever reason people like it, but it has a higher transaction volume or something than Bitcoin, and for whatever reason that's what sweeps the world. But suppose instead of it just maxing out at 21 million, it actually has a thing built into its protocol such that it expands in the beginning and then it maxes out and then it starts shrinking by 1% year after year after that. And then you say, oh, would that make it impossible to use that thing as and no. I'm saying because now, again, in that world, it opens up the possibility that investors, people just lending the money, not investing in physical processes, would be willing to tolerate a negative nominal interest rate because they don't have the alternative of just holding cash and earning zero. By stipulation, we're saying, however that cryptocurrency works, whatever amount you own today, we're saying after the passage of a year, the amount you own shrinks. That's just how the protocol works. Like it's burning coins. Okay, so you could have that, and you could say whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying if that happened to be the case and everybody were using that as the money, the economy could still work. And I'm just saying, notice that opens up the possibility of negative nominal rates. So my point in going down that is that I'm just saying what are the two things that would contribute to consumer prices measured in a given type of money falling over time? And I'm saying it's either the flow of real output is rising over time, right? So for a given stock of money, if there's more goods and services being produced, other things equal, that would lower the price per unit. Or the other possibility is, even if real GDP is constant, if the stock of money is shrinking over time, then other things equal, that would mean the price of the goods and services measured in the money would also fall. And so I'm just showing you that in either scenario, there's nothing really to worry about vis-a-vis this issue of, wouldn't too high of a deflationary CPI mean that there's problems with investment? Because again, with the expansion of output, you're saying, oh man, if the economy is growing too fast in real terms and just our production of goods and services is rising too fast, won't that mean we can't have rising production of goods and services? I was like, no. By stipulation in that scenario, we have rising goods and services. Okay, so there's that. And then the flip side is, if for some reason the money that everyone happens to be using, the stock of that is shrinking over time, wouldn't that imply a problem with being able to lend at the appropriate real rate? I'm saying no, because then in that scenario, the thing about, investors could always just sit on their money and earn a 0% rate of return, that's no longer true. Okay, so anyway, just a way to bookend and realize that these seemingly glib demonstrations by which, if consumer price inflation is too severe, that means the economy gets crippled, that doesn't follow. Okay. I will wrap it up there. Thanks for your attention, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.